It's the latest catchphrase to enter the free speech battlegrounds. Public figures publicly shamed for expressing their point of view. Is this form of social media justice justified, or does it spell the erosion of public discourse? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is the phenomenon of cancel culture. An open letter signed by some of America's most prominent intellectuals is fueling a debate over free speech. 532 words published in Harper's Magazine speak of a climate of intolerance, of being shamed and ostracized for expressing controversial views. But rather than eliciting sympathy, the letter seemed to have the opposite effect, with a swift and harsh backlash from the online court of public opinion. So, was this just a complaint by those who refuse to be held accountable for what they say, or another sign of the increasingly combative tone of public debate? Natalie Pahonen has more on social media's digital divide.
What is cancel culture? According to one definition, it's the removing of support for public figures in response to their objectionable behaviour or opinions. This can include boycotts or refusal to promote their work. This cancelling usually happens over social media after a person has been called out for their actions or words. It can lead to a public pile-on and mass shaming of an individual. The consequences can be very real, leaving the person at the centre of the storm feeling silenced and their livelihoods threatened. But there is a flip side. Some of the first instances of calling out others were done by people of colour highlighting acts of workplace racism. Social media platforms enabled them to hold others to account. Yet there are strong criticisms of cancel culture, particularly over whether it's fostering an environment of intolerance and eroding free speech. In a letter published in Harper's Magazine, several prominent journalists, thinkers and writers said the free exchange of information and ideas was becoming more restricted. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counter-speech from all quarters, but it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. Even legumes aren't immune. Goya Foods is the largest Hispanic-owned food company in the US. Its beans are now at the centre of a cancel culture backlash. It started after CEO Bob Unanue made these comments.
We're all truly blessed at the same time to have a leader like President Trump, who is a builder.
It didn't go down well. The hashtags GoyaWay and Boycott Goya started trending on social media. Julian Castro, who was an early candidate in the Democratic primary race, tweeted, "Unanue is praising a president who villainizes and maliciously attacks Latinos for political gain." Republican Senator Ted Cruz said the left is trying to cancel Hispanic culture and silence free speech. Goya's CEO says the boycott of goods is an attack on his free speech. He was able to say that through the media. So is cancel culture curbing the online space for ideas or expanding the landscape for who gets to comment? Natalie Pahonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, we are joined now by one of the signatories of the letter published in Harper's Magazine, Clare Potter. She's a historian at the New School for Social Research and an opinion writer at the New York Times. Also joining us is freelance journalist Waqas Mirza. He wrote an op-ed called "Cries of Cancel Culture Are a Tantrum by the Powerful." And activist Kelechi Egwim is the executive director of Appeal Incorporated, a Black empowerment organization. Claire, you are one of the signatories of the letter on justice and open debate, which bemoans the lack of intolerance in public discourse. Are the boundaries of what can be said in the realms of the public discourse getting narrower by the day?
I think it goes through different phases. And certainly social media changed everything by giving a platform to a mass audience that could criticize at will and actually get to people that they never could get to before. Um, but I would actually like to begin by saying the signatories all signed a letter that began with support for the social movements that are now trying to change things and create a social revolution in the United States today. So that's one thing. I would like to say another thing, which is the major threat from censorship is still from the state. And that's true in the United States, and that's true around the globe, even more so. That being said, I think it's important to note that I don't know a journalist today or an academic that does not fear that what they publish will cause them to lose their job. And that's just a fact. And that may be a victory of cancel culture, but I think those of us who care about the free exchange of ideas are deeply and profoundly concerned about it.
Waqas, how do you respond to this? Clare is saying that there is a reprisal in public for things that are being said, that people might be afraid to express themselves for fear that they might be antagonized and offend someone. Would you agree with that?
I think there certainly is, a change that social media has brought about. And even before that, I think blogs in the early 2000s that allowed people who were, uncredentialed and previously marginalized voices who could hold people who were publishing in major outlets accountable for what they were saying. So I think that has been a positive shift over the years. I don't know if there is a significant cultural shift where every writer or academic is now in fear of what they write or what they publish. I think there are certainly isolated instances where people have been, people have lost their jobs over things they have written, or people who have been threatened by university administrators. And I think that's kind of a different shift altogether that we can maybe talk about, how education or higher education specifically has been commodified, and students are increasingly opting to complain to administrator for, if they are disappointed in a product that they have purchased or paid for. So I think there are different trends here. One other thing that I would like to mention is the nature of at-will employment in the United States, where employers are essentially free to fire employees for no reason at all. And I think the kind of precariousness of employment plays into this a little bit. So I think there are different conversations to be had about how people who are engaged in, the free exchange of ideas can have a stronger sort of support for what they're saying. What I do object to is this idea that there is a widespread cancel culture, mainly because it collapses all of these different things together and kind of, corrupts the conversations that we need to be having.
Kelechi, do you perceive and observe an environment in the United States and perhaps even beyond where intolerance of opposing views is increasing dramatically?
Well, I think it's being diversified. I mean, I think the intolerance of opposing views is definitely not a new thing. I mean, they used to call it blacklisting, now they call it cancel culture, but it's the same thing. Eartha Kitt famously had a session in the White House with Lady Bird Johnson, where she made some very reasonable comments about the culture and systemic racism in America. And that was the last time anybody heard of her in the arts. So, Colin Kaepernick was canceled by the whole entire league and the NFL, and I didn't see any Harper's Magazine supporting or condemning that action. I don't think any of this is new. It's just that now the gatekeepers are being scrutinized and they don't like it.
So you don't think the letter that is being published by those 150 some intellectuals and author bears any merit?
Well, I wouldn't say there's no merit to it. When I first read the letter, it sounded very reasonable until you realize that Harper's Magazine has been around since 1850. That's during slavery. So there's a whole lot of history of blacklisting and exclusion of people based on what they think, say, and write. that they didn't seem to have an objection to. So it's odd that now that you see this uprising going on about social justice, all of a sudden they are offended by the culture that that seeks to hold people accountable. The only thing that has changed is that people being held accountable are folks who always thought they were untouchable, and now they realize they're not.
Claire, I want to give you a chance to respond to this because the argument is being made that this letter is primarily signed and supported by people who now seem to have lost the ability to dictate the public discourse. The untouchable have now become touchable, says Kelechi Egwim. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's unproven. And I'd actually like to respond to the question of Harper's Magazine. It has been around since 1850, and it was a major platform for abolitionists. So not everything that's been around during slavery is a terrible thing. Harper's did give a platform to people who were considered unspeakably radical at a moment when various states were actually suppressing their speech. But I'd also like to say that everybody on the list is not a gatekeeper. A fair number of them are freelance writers. And I think what was said earlier about the fact that both academic and labor and journalism are people with casual employment is extraordinarily important. So there is, in fact, a level of vulnerability. It's easier to dispose of a writer or teacher than it is to face public disapproval about them.
And Waqas, indeed, if we look at the names that have signed the letter, they come from both the so-called left and the right. So obviously it's a concern that is shared by many. It's not certainly just monopolized and placed in one camp only.
Well, I don't think the people from different camps who signed the letter did it for the same exact reasons. I think, someone like Barry Weiss, certainly the former New York Times writer, certainly doesn't care about free speech. I mean, she made her name as an undergraduate student trying to get her professors fired. So I don't think this is a person who actually truly cares about free speech. Much of the center and the right that has signed on to the letter has done it for its own reasons. I think the entire episode can be encapsulated by, J.K. Rowling's recent tweet about expanding on her anti-transphobe tweets from prior, where she essentially turned off the responses to her tweet. So I think that is what this is about for the center and the right. They are essentially afraid of now being subjected to an unrelenting stream of criticism from those who previously did not have a voice. And I think the J.K. Rowling episode indicates that quite clearly.
Kelechi, certainly everybody, I think internationally, would agree that racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, all these things have to be condemned and shunned by the public. But what about political opinion? It seems to me that everybody is just looking to have their own political opinion reaffirmed in this particular instance and time.
Yes, and I think that's called democracy. When you democratize, the media, when you democratize, the voices that are coming out, you're going to hear voices you don't like, you don't agree with. Some may be see them as extreme, some may not be extreme enough. Democracy doesn't mean all the people that agree with you. When you really diversify the landscape, you may realize that what you thought was the norm may not be the norm. And I think it's important to allow democracy in terms of the voices to shine and not be hampered by concerns of people who have been used to controlling what exactly people say, what people believe, what is newsworthy and what isn't newsworthy. I think this is a necessary turn, and of course you're going to have some overreaches. You're going to have some overreactions. You're going to have some individuals who have their own motivations that may not be necessarily true and sincere. But for the most part, what you're seeing is a rising of voices that haven't had an opportunity to speak before. And I think the general public is going to be able to discern what's valid and what's not. Not every body that's been proposed to be quote unquote canceled has been canceled. In many instances, it's been rejected because we realized there was no basis to it. But in some instances, folks like Matt Lauer and that you thought were untouchable are not untouchable anymore.
Claire, what do you make of the argument that people say, no, it's a good thing that this, if you, for lack of a better term, public court of opinion is necessary to serve as a corrective to make sure that powerful and influential people are being held accountable?
Well, I think it's a good argument about democracy, that if you let the most voices in possible, you're going to have the most democracy. I think that doesn't jive with what we actually know about social media. One of the phenomena after the letter was published is that following on the first wave of criticism of some of the signers were endless numbers of trolls and bad actors who are led to hotspots on the internet by people who are trying to cancel individuals. So it's not just that you're dealing with your critics, you're dealing with the alt web and the dark web who sort of surge in behind. I think the second thing to think about, and this comes back to the question of, does Barry Weiss really believe in free speech? We all signed the letter without knowing who else was signing it. And I think one of the things that these signatories get to do is actually hold each other accountable. To say to Barry Weiss, hey, you and I signed the same letter. Let's talk about how you're really responding in real time about free speech. I think that's really important. I also think it's important that various people interpreted the letter because it spoke in generalities, very specifically. They interpreted the letter as being about them. So the first wave of respondents was trans people saying, because J.K. Rowling is on this list, the whole letter has been aimed at us, right? And that simply wasn't true. And I think we have to ask ourselves a question. Is our democracy in trouble when people who disagree about something violently, as I disagree with J.K. Rowling, cannot find something that we actually believe in common and find some mutual way of committing to it, which is free speech?
Interestingly enough, even though he would probably not share the ideology of many of the signatories, President Donald Trump, actually weighed in and supported this particular notion of the letter. Here's what he had to say on 4th of July at a speech at Mount Rushmore.
We want free and open debate, not speech codes and cancel culture. We embrace tolerance, not prejudice.
Waqas, here is the President of the United States denouncing cancel culture. Interestingly enough, many people call him actually the Chancellor-in-Chief. He's someone who oftentimes is shunning and exposing people on social media.
Yeah, I think that just goes to show that, the very phrase cancel culture is so utterly bereft of any meaning that people can latch onto it for whatever their political purposes are. But to go back to Claire's point, I think we're not saying that you can't sign a letter with people that you disagree with. It's that people are doing it to further their own reasons, and I think that's important because J.K. Rowling is essentially saying a very different thing by signing the letter than some other signatories on the left may be saying. I mean, she actually is concerned about the fact that, there are people on social media who are holding her accountable. And that's why she sees fit to actually not engage or not have any engagement from social media, which, is perfectly okay for her to do. But I think it's not that you can't sign a letter with people you disagree with. It's that they're doing it for very different reasons.
Well, I think it's rather clear there's no love lost between President Trump and his predecessor, President Barack Obama. Not many issues they see eye to eye and agree on. But here's what President Obama had to say on cancel culture.
If I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right or used the wrong verb, then I can sit back and feel pretty good about myself. Because, man, you see how woke I was? I called you out. Let me get on TV, watch my show, watch Grownish. That's not activism. That's not bringing about change. If all you're doing is casting stones, you're probably not going to get that far. That's easy to do.
No, Kelechi, there is President Obama denouncing, if you will, cancel culture and saying that's not activism, that is not going to bring about sustainable change, just ganging up on people online and shouting them down. What do you have to say?
Yeah, I don't think that's what he was saying at all. I don't think he was saying anything about cancel culture. I think he was making a comment about internet activism and people thinking that they can, comment about this and that and post this and that and think that they're bringing about change. I didn't hear him say anything about cancel culture or if it's even a thing, because really people seem to define it however they want to. I just think it's important to realize that this is not a new thing. The only thing that's changed is the people that are being targeted by it. That's the only thing that has changed.
Well, he was talking
the
about the
voices,
so-called woke generation that is casting stones at opinions that they don't agree with.
right? Yes, and that's a good thing. But that in and of itself is not cancel culture. That's really just people who are on their couches, who have some degree of consciousness or raised consciousness recently, who are speaking out on the internet. In other words, you have to have the power to cancel. It's interesting that how many black journalists and writers and editors are in these newsrooms who have even the opportunity to be canceled. How many of them, how diversified are these newsrooms and these media centers to even have an opportunity to be canceled? Even that's a privilege, just to be there to be canceled. I don't think that's what he was talking about. And I think you're always in strange company when you're in the same company with Donald Trump.
Claire, how do we get out of this? At the end of the day, certainly this is a very polarized political environment, not just in the United States, but we see it in various different countries and geographic regions. How do we bring people together again? How do we open up the debate and ensure pluralism without hurling insults at each other?
Well, I'd like to emphasize two things that have been said by the other guests. One is, I think, the precarity of employment, particularly among culture workers, actually drives people into a frenzy when they see people who are relatively secure in their jobs behaving in ways that they think are irresponsible and destructive. And so that I think is an economic problem. I think the second thing we need to talk about is exactly how many people of color are in these newsrooms. But it is also the case that women of color suffer disproportionately from being harassed and trolled online. And I think unless we come to terms with the fact that the people who are canceled are not just collateral damage, are not just people who deserved it, are not just people whose terrible mistake revealed that they have horrible character, and we come to terms with the phenomenon itself and agree to a kind of self-government and really looking at this more objectively, I don't think we're going to get anywhere.
Waqas, the argument is being made that you defeat a bad argument by persuasion, through persuasion, and by presenting a counter-argument rather than drowning out voices and opinions. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't know what is being called drowning out other voices and opinions. I think that is free speech. I mean, counter arguments are going to be amplified in social media. And social media does have this effect of making it seem like you're being besieged by trolls, even when, there may be a couple hundred people responding to something you've written. So I think we shouldn't escalate these things into a significant cultural moment when really they've been around for a while, and it's just that the targets and the people who are actually being able to criticize, whatever happens in the traditional media as something of a new thing. But more importantly, I think the very term cancel culture is just is not helpful. I think it lumps together various different things, which we already have language for. We know what racist and trollish attacks on social media are. We know, when an academic is threatened for writing or researching something that isn't universally popular. So we know what these different things are. We don't need to lump them together into something, amorphous called cancel culture. I think that really distracts from the conversations we need to be having.
Kelechi, do you fear that the polarization of opinions out there, of politics, of ideologies is going to increase as we move along? Or do you see a way out? Do you have a solution?
Well, I think the voices need to be heard. I think that voices that we haven't even thought of need to be heard. I think we need to diversify and as much as we can democratize the conversation, so that those corners of the world, the internet, the of journalism, these small publications that no one's ever heard of, those authors and writers and creators, get to have their voice heard, even if they wouldn't have been otherwise. I think we need to, as much as possible, diversify the voices that are being heard. That's the way to progress. It's going to be very uncomfortable, and it's not a surgical instrument. It's a blunt instrument, but it's necessary, because that's the only way you're really going to have the create the type of diversity we need in media. Media is not immune to playing a role in structural racism.
Right.
It actually plays a significant role in it. So if you don't ever diversify, you can never really have change. There's a reason why the American president you played earlier find necessary to make the media his first target, because he knows that as long as he controls the media, or at least he can paint it in a certain light, he can do whatever he wants to do and have no criticism.
Hate to interrupt you there, but unfortunately we're out of time, and diversity of opinion matters, obviously one that we have displayed today. It was a pleasure to get your insights, Clare Potter, Kelechi Egwim, and Waqas Mirza, and thank you out there for watching as well. Hope to see you again next time for a new edition of Newsmakers.